fine speech. I now look to Jeea Chadha, Women's Officer, Wadham College, to open the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Madam President, for this opportunity to be speaking here today at the Oxford Union. I must admit that it's an honour to be representing the mean streets of Harrow, home to one of the greatest bastions of access and outreach, Harrow School. Today we are discussing the future of the Commonwealth. So with that in mind, let's first discuss what we mean by no future. The phrasing of no future lends itself to the idea that the Commonwealth should be completely disbanded, that this group of countries which have a shared colonial history should no longer have these structural ties. The proposition will tell you that we should dismantle the Commonwealth, as it's a colonial relic of the past. But this too is a misspirited othering that my speech will address. The proposition will fall for the very same traps that we here in the West fall for, thinking that it's better to try and forget and erase our past than to move on with the past in mind. But before I prove to you that I'm right, it falls on me to introduce the proposition. Opening the case for the proposition, we have just heard from Daniel Dipper, a member of the Standing Committee and otherwise known as DJ Dan. Now, as it's tradition to roast the candidates, or speakers rather, I was struggling here, however, I think his DJ sets speak for themselves. Next, we'll hear from Robert Guest, who in his career has travelled to Tokyo, South Korea, parts of Africa, so you'd be forgiven for confusing him with a gap year student on Tinder. But actually, he is an esteemed journalist for The Economist and has written 2 books, The Shackled Continent and Borderless Economics. He also regularly appears on CNN and the BBC. Finally, we'll hear from Tanvi Kanchanadam, an American. It's an honour to be speaking with such great people. Madam President, these are your speakers and they are most welcome. Madam President, it will shock you to find out that I'm not a PPEist. In fact, I'm far worse, a HISPOL student from Wadham. So essentially, I think that we should just print more money, right? But this history background has absolutely influenced the way I've thought about this motion. I've seen a new drive to see history, not just from the perspective of the victors. While Britain has benefited from colonialism, others have suffered from its reign. So while we rush to apologise for the crimes of the past, in the same breath, we punish countries for the atrocities, for the consequences of those very crimes. Dismantling the Commonwealth will not make the atrocities of colonialism disappear. Now, this is not the usual way that a speaker will try and get the votes of their audience, but here goes anyway. We are weird. What I mean by this is that most of us in this room are Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic, even though obviously sometimes as students we may not feel that rich. As Joseph Henrik observed, it is these characteristics that change the way we think and the way we perceive others, on both an individual and a geopolitical level. This means that in our Western society, we have a blind spot in that we see the world through a Western lens rather than a global one. We have expectations of how countries should behave solely based on a Western experience. When assessing geopolitical affairs, both past and present, from the Vietnam War to our interactions with countries like India and China when discussing our climate emergency, it is clear to see that we fundamentally misunderstand other countries. So this brings us on to the question then of why we should still put our faith into the Commonwealth. Because in order to avoid being chained to this weird perspective, we must consider the Commonwealth not just as a dirty little secret of the past, but as a unilateral NGO for the future. We need to use it to prevent us from having a neo-colonial mindset in dealing with foreign affairs, a mindset that still continues the global hegemony of the West above the rest. The continuation of the Commonwealth that I am proposing would allow us to collaborate together, putting countries of all stages of economic development on a level playing field that works together to overcome the pressing issues of our time. And in a time where previously subjugated countries are now having a greater say on the world stage than ever before, at a time where we are seeking the perspectives not just of the historical victors, and at a time where we face some of the biggest global emergencies, having a better understanding of who we are, both weird and not weird, is vital now and in the decades to come. So whilst I could give you a list of everything I'd want to propose to reshape the Commonwealth and to prove that it can be a force for good, I've chosen to focus on the biggest crisis facing our time, since, as always, I like to make things easier for myself. Through its Commonwealth Climate Change Programme, the organisation helps member countries access their funding needs to meet their Paris Agreement commitments. But this to me sounds like the West falling in the same traps and not being clued enough on a non-weird perspective. As Jeea Chadha discusses, Britain, who once lectured her colonies 200, 300, 400 years ago, are still lecturing them now, telling them how they should cut down on their carbon emissions, how they should use their national budget for climate-related spending. This is a neo-colonial mindset in all but name. The programme that lends money to member states to help them in their drive for lower carbon emissions, as if it were not their money already. Between 1765 and 1938, the British stole £45 trillion from India. £45 trillion. This is a neo-colonial structure in all but name, a structure that refuses to admit the crimes of the past. And so while the proposition will tell you that these are the reasons why the Commonwealth should have no future, the reality is that having no future exacerbates this problem. This is exactly why we need the Commonwealth. We need to reshape it, to overcome the blind spots that have led us to build these structures that continue a long and tragic history of colonialism. We need the Commonwealth as a way to understand other countries from a non-Westernized perspective, so that we can truly come together and solve these emergencies. Because unless we understand different perspectives and understand that we cannot punish Commonwealth countries for our crimes, then we will never be fighting the same fight. We will never reverse the atrocities of colonialism, the individual tragedies. We can't erase those mistakes, but we can ensure that they never happen again. And we can ensure that we look to the future in a way that understands the plights of these colonies and interacts with former colonies rather, and interacts with them as equals, not as colonies. If we destroy the Commonwealth as an institution, we are increasing our division, our othering of nations, and will continue this cycle. I am Indian. I have a personal link to colonialism. I hear stories from my grandfather about how my family fled Pakistan after the partition. I can still feel the disasters of the past. While you shouldn't believe me just because I'm Indian, what I'm trying to say is that I've considered the ramifications of the Commonwealth, considered the horrors of colonialism, and I still believe in an international community that works together. If this house is a house of free speech, then it's a house of bravery too. So let us be brave. Let us own the past and look to the future.